Yes.
Okay, so officially, everyone, welcome to Landlording Your Way to Retirement. I am Melissa Hartvickson with More Realty, and my co-host here is Chris Watkins with Borrow Smart.
Mhm.
So, why would you invest in real estate? Um, Obvious, or at least to me, is investment diversity. If anybody's out there got their 401k or their SEP IRA, their stock market investments, real estate is a good way to balance that and offset that. Unlike a lot of other assets, though, rental real estate or real estate that you're flipping, you can borrow against the asset without real penalty for doing that. You also get some additional tax write-offs, especially as a landlord. I'm going to put a caveat out there right now that neither Chris nor I are CPAs, but we are both active real estate investors who are taking advantage of things like writing off our miles and repair items at our rentals. And the other thing that I think is important, and we'll show you in this class, is that you actually have some control on your returns. It's a lot more predictable to invest in real estate than it is to, say, put your money on the stock market, whether you're picking bonds or stocks. This is very predictable, and we'll show you how. Getting started, this is for all the fellow math nerds out there. I promise for the ones who aren't, we do have a shortcut later. But these are important terms for you to get used to if you're getting into landlord real estate investing and real estate investing in general, so that you can understand how to evaluate properties. So GRM is abbreviation for gross rent multiplier. And I've heard some people say that this is basically the number of years it takes a property to be self-sufficient. I would say that's a very narrow view of gross rent multiplier because it doesn't take into effect any of your expenses like your mortgage or repair costs, anything like that. And to compare properties using gross rent multiplier, you need to compare multiple properties against each other. The formula for this, as you can see on the screen, is your gross income divided by the price. Another common term that we have is net operating income, abbreviated as NOI. And this is our gross rent minus our fixed expenses. Fixed expenses are things like property taxes and insurance. They're not things like, oh no, the toilet got clogged. Then we have capitalization rate, or cap rate for short, which is the net operating income divided by the market value. And I would say most rental real estate investors are using this as their baseline for whether or not they should further evaluate a property. So down in Eugene, your guys' cap rate for B-class properties is 5.6. Up in the Portland Metro, we're actually 5.3. Another important thing to know is cash flow. This is your rent minus all of your expenses. And last but not least is your return on investment. So you take your annual return divided by your out-of-pocket expense, and this is expressed as a percentage. So for those of you who are used to investing in the stock market and you're like, I'm going to get a 10% return year one, that does not happen in real estate, not in this market, not in Eugene, not in Portland, and probably most of the other places in the country, unless you're doing a flip or a BRRRR project. But if you're buying an existing rental, the numbers are a lot more bleak than that. But it's not about just first year returns. They compound over time. So next, we're going to focus on teaching everyone here to think like an investor. We're not buying a dream house. This isn't about warm and fuzzy feelings. And I know some of my clients, since I'm a realtor, are all about the warm and fuzzy feelings, but I want everybody who's on this Zoom tonight to throw that out the window, because we're thinking about how we're going to make money. And there's three main principles that we're going to focus on to teach you that tonight. So one is leverage, which Chris is the star there, so he'll jump in on the leverage slide here in a minute. The 75% rule, and this is the shortcut math for the people who don't like all the other formulas we just showed you, and using other people's money.
So I will make one note on what Melissa said, how rental real estate, you're not going to be earning 10% returns, you know, and that I would say that that is specifically a cash on cash return. So there are a lot of different types of returns that go into owning rental real estate. Cash on cash is the easiest one to understand how much you make per year versus how much you have invested. But rental real estate offers a number of different ways to add on to that cash on cash return that can bump it much higher than what you can get on the stock market. And one of the reasons that you can do that is because of leverage. So when you have, if you have $100,000 to invest, you have, if you want to put it in the stock market, you can buy $100,000 worth of stock. As that goes up, say 10% a year, great, you've made $10,000 in your first year. But if you are taking that same $100,000 and you use it as a 20% down payment on a piece of property, you can buy a $500,000 you can buy a $500,000 house with that $100,000 payment. And even if that house only appreciates, say, 5% over the first year, which is less than the 10% of the stocks, you also own, I mean, you own a $500,000 investment. So your cash on cash return would actually be $25,000 rather than the $10,000 that you would get with stocks. So the magic of leverage is one of the biggest reasons that real estate is one of, if not the best plan towards long-term wealth in this country. So borrowing money from others, whether that's other people, individuals, or it's banks, is the way to really juice up the returns on an investment. And it is a double-edged sword, but it is by itself one of the major reasons why real estate is so attractive. Ding. So the way that most people take advantage of leverage is by getting a mortgage. Most people can't afford a property to pay 100% cash up front. And if you want to use leverage and the magic of it, you don't want to be buying things in cash necessarily. So what you do is you get a mortgage from here, and here are four of the main types of mortgages that are out there. And there are a lot of variants within these, but your basic categories are, the first two are your VA, which is veterans, and your FHA, the Federal Housing Authority, excuse me. Those are both actually backed by the federal government. The third column is your conventional loan, which is quasi-backed by the federal government. The fourth is specifically for investors. Now, you can see the most attractive down payment option on all of these is reserved for the men and women who have served this country and are eligible for VA financing. You don't have to put any money down. And there are a lot of other benefits to VA loans, but they're obviously reserved for people who have served this country in a number of different capacities. So if you have access to a VA loan, it is a great way to get into real estate. It does have limitations of being limited to your relatively limited to your first property. So you're both the VA and FHA loans, because they're government backed, they are targeted at owner occupants. So FHA is another great low down payment option for house buyers. You only have to put 3.5% down. They do have some downsides to them, but they are generally great for first-time home buyers and folks who are just new to the home purchasing experience, or as investors as well. You can buy and want up to a 4-unit building with either VA or FHA. But again, owner occupied is the way that you need to approach both of those. Now, conventional loans, you can put as little as 3% down, and as little as 5% down for a 2 to 4 unit. You're going to get the best rates with a conventional. There are fewer restrictions. And the far right, the investor column, when you purchase a piece of property that is not going to be owner occupied, it's considered an investor occupied property, and you are going to need to put a lot more as a down payment 15% is very, very best case. Typically it's 20 or 25% as a down payment. So we'll talk about a lot of different strategies on how to get around these requirements, or how to use them to your best, how to use each strategy to its most effective way. So ding.
So this is an example of an actual client of mine back in 2019. And the reason why I like to use this is a lot of people think that they can't afford to get into real estate. And this particular client wanted to have a single family home and they wanted to have a yard, but their max pre-approval was 300,000. And back in 2019, the median house price in Portland was already well over 400, and they were priced out of houses. But they took the same class with me back then. And decided to jump in on the duplexing and become landlords. And the point of this was their lender was able to use rental income to help them qualify for more. So this is like leverage on superpowers. Not only are we borrowing money from the bank, but we're counting rent from the tenants to help bolster our qualification. I'm not going to go through the math on each of these, but I just do want to point out that the difference in out of pocket at closing for the additional $100,000 that they were leveraging was $3,000 out of their pocket. And after collecting rent from their tenant, their payments were actually $500 less every month. And this client of mine is actually just getting ready to buy a house. They're moving out and they're going to be well over cash flow positive on this, because market rent on that now is, instead of $1,250 on the other unit, is $1,800. So they're in a really good position. Back when I was helping them analyze this deal, I said, hey, let's look at this like how an investor would look at it. And yes, I know rates were much better in 2019. An investor could get the loan for 5% back then. And they were putting $100K down, and my clients were putting the $28,000 down to get into this property. And at the end of the year, after accounting for some fixed expenses like vacancy, property taxes, and insurance, an investor would say, hey, I'm going to make 22K this year. I'm cash flow positive. And in our market, that's pretty decent. And they would have thought about it. Further, if they were really looking to the future, and we used a 3% assumption for increase in property value, increase in rent, and also 3% on all of their expenses to adjust for inflation and things in the future. And my clients will not have the same cash flow that this investor would have had if they bought the same duplex, right? Because they had bigger payments and they were just subsidizing their mortgage. But when they get all the way down to year 30, when their loan is almost paid off, they're making $35K a year, just like the investor would. But they put down a quarter of the money and were willing to live next door to their tenants. So this is one of the powerful strategies that we're teaching, is think like an investor, move into the unit, save money by subsidizing your mortgage, and then move on to your next one. So this is the shortcut math that I like to teach. And part of the reason why I came up with using 75% of the gross rent to see whether or not covers principal and interest of a mortgage is because lenders like Chris, when they're counting rental income for your qualification, are deducting money for property taxes, insurance, and those fixed expenses off the top. So if you had $1,000 in rent, Chris is going to give you credit for $750. That also works to say, when we're looking at principal and interest of the mortgage, we're not factoring in your taxes and insurance. So we're just saying, do most of the rents cover at least that? Worth an extra look. Doesn't mean we're offering on it yet. This is just quick math for you to see. So we have an actual example. I think a couple of guys in here might recognize this as the fourplex that they've offered on. So this fourplex was listed for $945,000 after several price drops and being on the market for 18 months. And the gross rents are $9,088 per month. So let's take the 9,088 and multiply it by 75%, and we get 6,816. And courtesy of my mortgage calculator on NerdWallet, the principal and interest for this loan at 8.25% would be 5,480. So that $6,816 more than covers the principal and interest. And even if we add in our property management fees at 8%, insurance and property taxes, even accounting for those fixed expenses on top of the principal and interest, out-of-pocket costs would be $7,500 a month. So this is still potentially cash flow positive and worth a deeper look. I will say with the caveat though, the 75% rule very seldom works on multiplexes. Most people who are realtors who are pricing them don't price them to cash flow right now. At a 5.3% cap rate in Portland, this property is over $1.4 million. And because the interest rate, it does not cash flow at that point. So if you find something that meets this rule, it's a diamond in the rough and you should at least go look at it. Chris,
Very
did you
much.
have something?
All right. Melissa, I will say, I noticed that the chat is disabled, at least on my screen. So maybe when we'll talk through the next couple slides, you can see if we can open that up so people can ask questions.
Yeah, let me change that.
So again, one of the great parts of real estate is that you get to use other people's money to make your own money. There are a couple of ways that people can be helped to get into the door in the first place. This is a lot less true today than it was a few years ago, that there are incentive programs. There are ways that you can pay as little as 0% down. Those again are relatively few and far between here in the Northwest because they often have income restrictions. And as we all know, housing is expensive here in the Northwest. And so if you make enough money to be able to afford a house, you're over those income restrictions. So there are, like I said, those programs are fewer and far between now. There are gift funds. You can use funds from family members and other folks that you know in order to put as a down payment on a property. But the biggest way that you're using other people's money when investing in real estate is that your tenants are paying you every month and they are paying your mortgage. They're paying your expenses. They're hopefully paying all of your expenses plus a little bit that you get to pocket every month. And that is something that can continue hopefully in perpetuity as people continue to rent your properties. So let's jump into a short list of some of the many types of investing strategies that people employ here. I will mention right off the bat that we are not going to really talk about flipping much in this in this webinar here. Flipping is an investment strategy, but it's more of a cash flow strategy than it is a long-term investment strategy. So we're not going to cover much of that here. The first one we call is house hacking, which is similar to the scenario that Melissa just mentioned, where somebody buys a property, typically a 2 to 4 unit property. They live in one of those units and then they rent the others out and have the other tenants pay some, if potentially all of their mortgage. The second strategy here, one that Melissa employs, is called a house hopper, which is essentially you buy a house and you live in it for at least a year, and then you turn that into a rental property and you buy a second house. And so now you have 2 properties in your portfolio. Your tenants are paying off the first mortgage and you live in that second property for as little as a year, and you hop again to the next property while retaining it as a rental. The third is kind of a college style where you're renting by the room, short and midterm rentals, which again, we'll get into a little bit further down the road. The fourth is what has been dubbed the BRRRR strategy, where you're actually adding value on the front end and taking advantage of creating that value to refinance down the road. And the last one here we'll say is purchasing and then trading up later with your improved equity. So the traditional house hack is, again, very similar to what Melissa just described. You're buying a duplex, you're renting out one side and living in the other. This is a great way. This is one of the great beginner strategies. If you're able to, because you're able to use some of that rental income to qualify for something more than you would qualify for if you were just buying a single family rental. You can use, because you're going to own or occupy the property, you can utilize a much lower down payment, 3 or 5%. This is a great way for people to, and because you live in the property yourself, you're close to the tenants, you have a better eye on the property, and you can help fix things up a lot more easily than if you own something in another part of the town or another state even. Ding.
The house hopper is, well, Chris said, this is kind of my thing that I've done to build my portfolio. You buy a house or a condo and you live there for at least a year and then you move and repeat. The downside of this strategy is that you're covering the entire mortgage until you leave. And it may take a couple of years to break even after you're gone. You cash flow over time, but houses do tend to appreciate more than multifamily units. Just for all of those who are new to the Oregon real estate investing market, we do have a statewide rent cap. The cap for 2024 is 9.9%. So you're limited to raising your rents by that much. So that directly affects your property appreciation. However, in single family homes, sorry guys, I don't know the Eugene statistics as well as I know the Portland ones, but we literally had neighborhoods in 2020, 21, and 22 that appreciated 25% or better all 3 years. So single family rental property owners made out on appreciation, where the long-term landlords with the multiplexes didn't earn as much in appreciation during those years. College style, short-term or midterm. Chris and I actually both employ some of these strategies. So maybe I'll talk about college style and let Chris take short-term and midterm. But college style is great for the younger crowd. We're a little bit more flexible about having roommates, but buy his house with as many bedrooms as you can and literally rent out room by room. This is really great because it's consistent income and it's a lot easier to cash flow when you move out. If you rent your room to another roommate, rent by room frequently in my market, and I'm willing to bet that in Eugene it's the same, will net you more than the gross rent on the house. I can rent out rooms depending on where you are in the metro area, anywhere from $800 to $1,400 per room. And I can rent a 3-bedroom house for $2,700. So
yeah, that is definitely the case here, especially around the university. It's a strategy employed by a lot of people, and especially if you're younger. I know somebody who's trying to do this right now, to buy a rental for him and his friends, using some of his parents' money to do so. And it's a great way to get into the market. And again, you can charge a lot more per room. It's a form of arbitrage that can be very profitable. So STR and MTR, that stands for short-term rental and midterm rental. And most people will know this by the other acronym, which is the other title, which are Airbnbs. So these are less than 12-month term leases. So everybody here, I'm sure, understands the concept of an Airbnb, where you have people who come to stay for as little as 1 night to as many as 3 to 6 months, and sometimes. And you're renting out your house. It's sporadic income. It's something that you have high seasons and low seasons. Right now in Eugene, June is the highest of the high seasons, with graduations and track events and all sorts of things, people coming into town. It's a great time. But then when you are in January and February and nobody's coming to town, your income drops significantly. You're also, if you are owning a short-term or a midterm rental, and I will say, sorry, midterm rental refers to anything over 30 days. And there are some legal definitions there that we'll get to in a sec. If you own a short-term rental or a mid-term rental, you are in the hospitality business, and people have much higher expectations of what the house is going to look like, what their room is going to look like, getting taken care of, getting calls in the middle of the night or over the weekend. You have a lot more time where you are on as an owner of a short-term or mid-term rental, or at least an operator. You may not necessarily operate it if you own it. Like me, I have a property manager for my short-term rental. One of the other issues with short-term and mid-term rentals, mostly short-term, is that there are a lot of regulations, especially in places where people like to vacation. It's great to own a property in a place that you want to visit throughout the year, but a lot of these towns like Bend and the coast and other parts of the state that are higher in tourist traffic, they place a lot of restrictions on how many rentals, short-term rentals there can be, how much you can charge, and lots of other things that can change over time. So it's a great strategy from a cash flow perspective, but it is also can be fraught with a little bit of more regulatory risk. So, and then the BRRRR strategy. So this is the one that I like to employ because I have 20 plus years of rehab construction experience. I love buying fixer-uppers. I love buying houses that need a little bit more, need a little bit of, yeah, a little bit of work, or sometimes a lot of work that other people are overlooking. So the 5 letters here. So first you have to buy a property, typically one that needs a bit of work, so it's not going to sell for as much on the market, or it'll be off the market because they can't sell it, list it as you would a typical house. The first R is for rehab or repair. So this is where you fix it up, you put in that sweat equity, you put in money to do all the things to bring it up to code, to bring it up to livability. Then you rent it out. So you're finding short, midterm, or long-term tenants. This strategy can work with all of those. And because you have fixed the house up, it is now going to appraise at hopefully a much higher value, which allows you to get a loan for hopefully more than what you paid for, plus the cost that you put into the property. So you can at times pull some of, or maybe potentially all of your money, your upfront capital out when you refinance, and you use that money to repeat and do this again. So again, this can be combined with owning a short-term rental. So I have a duplex that I BRRR'd, and the downstairs is a short-term rental, the upstairs is a long-term rental. So this is a great way to get into properties, to find deals, and is one of the ways that still works even in a high interest rate market like we are in now.
I would say it's one of the best ones to work in this market right
Yeah.
now. And then purchase now and trade up later. So my advice for those of you who don't have the skills to BRRRR a property, or maybe can't leverage into a fourplex so that you can benefit from breaking even or being close to cash flow, buy something that you like and live in it for now. Or if you can get something a little bigger than a condo, rent out rooms and add value and keep it for a while. And then house hack 5-10 years down the road. Hopefully it won't take you that long, but neither Chris nor I have a crystal ball, and we're not sure when rates are going to come down. For anybody who has short-term memory, the pandemic rates in the 2s or 3s will probably not happen again in any of our lifetimes. Historically, from the 1980s until 2019, before the pandemic, the average rate fell between 5.5 and 6, and rates at times were as high as 19, 20, especially for those who bought in the 80s. And rates of 7 or 8 weren't that uncommon even in the mid 2000s. So thinking that you're going to wait until rates get to 2 or 3, you may never get in the real estate game. So if you can afford to get in now, do Chris and I think they'll be somewhere between 5 and 6 a few years from now? Sure. But we don't know if that's 3 or 5 years. So buy something you can live in now, and then trade up to your next house and rent it out behind you. Obviously, more house hacking is a way that you can go. But 1031 exchange is a tax code which basically lets you sell an investment property and get a new one without paying capital gains on that sale. If you sell it in the future and cash out, you would pay the taxes at that time. So lots of more seasoned investors use this strategy to constantly kick the can down the road on paying the taxes and hopefully just pass it on to the next generation, and increasing the basis and not pay taxes at that point. 1031 is actually something that I've done quite a few times. After house hacking, I decided I moved 7 times in 5 years, that it was better for me to start trading out of some of the smaller properties. Let's talk about ways to identify the property. First, I think everyone should really think about what type of investment you would like to make. Not every property is going to be able to fit with everything that you want. If you wanted to be in Yachats, they don't allow any new short-term rental permits, for example. So if you wanted an Airbnb there, you might have to go to a town an hour away. Or if you're in Seaside outside the belt of 101 on the east side, you can't Airbnb. So if that's what you want to do, make sure you check with the local municipality to see if that works. Also think about, does the property have the amenities and features that would be attractive prospective tenants? If you're gonna get a cabin in the woods for your family that you want to rent out sometimes to other people, you know, is it near water? Do you have a hot tub? Do you have a fire pit? Do you have things that people are going to enjoy? If you're going the more long-term route, tenants really love having upgraded appliances and parking with garage and laundry. I know that might sound silly, but when you're comparing it to an apartment building with 300 units, going down to a duplex with only one shared wall might be an amenity that appeals to the kind of tenants that you want. So just think about what kind of tenants are going to be interested in the properties that you're looking at. And before you start offering on properties, check the rental market and say, okay, well, I think I want to run an Airbnb down by the stadium there in Eugene, which I think Chris can attest to. And Chris probably went on Airbnb and looked at how many other people were doing that. And what's unique about his property to make sure that it's going to get rented before the other ones are. In the Portland Metro, for example, I advise most of my clients against getting a 2-bedroom rental because that is the most saturated building type for apartments. And they've built thousands of them in the last 10 years. We have more 2-bedroom apartments than anything. So it's really great for people to either get a studio or a 3-bedroom or larger in the Portland market, for example. Then you want to find out whether or not the property's in good condition. So, you know, does the house have a roof that's actively leaking? Is that something that we can negotiate with the seller to take care of? Or can they drop the price so that you can take care of it? If the property is so dilapidated that the repairs are going to eat up your returns, it might not be a good property. It might initially look good mathematically, but when you physically go there, the condition might drive you away. And then also check comparable rental rates on properties to make sure that you're close to covering the mortgage. In our current market, it's really rare when anything is even remotely close to covering the mortgage, unless you're renting out room by room or employing short-term rentals at least part of the year. For those of you who want to start figuring out what kind of places you can analyze rents, these are some free tools that you can use. Both AirDNA and Rentometer will cut you off after a certain number of usages. So, and they'll ask you to start paying for them. But the trick is, if you're looking for, Chris has one. You're on mute, Chris.
I pay for both of those. So if you run out of times to analyze, just reach out and I can run a number for you.
I was going to say also, if you just log on Rentometer like a tenant and say compare my rent, you can do it unlimited. So that's another shortcut. For midterm rentals, I will say that Furnish Finder is most accurate for their 1-bedroom units. On their statistics page, they don't differentiate between 2-bedroom, 3-bedroom, 4-bedroom, or larger. So when you're looking at those higher rents, it's really hard if you're not a seasoned investor to figure out what your rent should be. And that's when you're looking to have your real estate professional, hopefully is a qualified person who can help you with that. And then for estimating future returns, I'm personally a big fan of calculator.net. They have lots of calculators, not just the financial calculators, but the rental property calculator that they have is actually the one that we used several slides ago to show you the future investment returns 30 years into the future. And for those of you who are Big Air Pockets members, they also have several rental property estimates for rent. They've got BRRRR strategy calculators. They've got long-term rental investment calculators. But for people who aren't paying for their memberships, you usually get limited to 5 calculator usage per.
Yeah.
Both Chris and I have accounts with unlimited access to those. So that's something else that I actually prefer when I'm working one-on-one with my clients to teach you how to use so that you can analyze your own deals. So we go through a few together, and then usually most of my clients are pretty successful at using it on their own after that.
Yeah. And if you're a spreadsheeter like me who likes making your own analysis tools, I've made my own that I do. I walk other people through as well, so we can reach out to me. I've got a couple of different spreadsheet tools that I use for analysis of my own deals that can, analyze something in 5 to 10 minutes or less, see whether it's worth putting more of your time into. So, ding. So the larger market questions surrounding each property decision are, and one that's at the forefront of most people's minds right now is, can this strategy work with current rates? As Melissa said, just buying a turnkey rental property with 25% down, 20 to 25% down, often is not going to cash flow right now. The Eugene may be a little bit softer than Portland, but it's not much.
We're most clients 40 to 50%.
Yeah, that's one of the strategies in order to cash flow is to put more money down, which, most people don't like to do. As an investor, I like to put as little as I can down. But if cash flow is your goal, then you may have to put substantially more down. Now, does a property have to cash flow to be a successful rental? No, it doesn't. Depending on your situation and how much you need cash flow wherever you are, you may not need something to cash flow right away if you feel like the property will appreciate well over time. And that's one of the things about the Northwest and the West Coast in general, is we are in what we call an appreciation market. So we don't cash flow like places in the Midwest or the South do, but we appreciate at a much higher rate. I think the average over the last 60 years is about 4.5% per year here in Oregon. So, but we want properties and cash flow as much as we can. So either you can put more money down to make that happen. You can buy down the interest rate at the beginning when you're purchasing the property, which will lower your payments. Like I mentioned in the BRRRR slide, doing a value add is going to also help a lot with that cash flow. Creating that value up front through your sweat equity or by repositioning into midterm or short-term rental can be really useful. Or you can be helping out the next generation. So buying a house for your children, getting them into a property is a great way for folks to start investing and to get their kids into a great situation that will help build their own portfolio and credit as they go along.
Sorry, I'm away. So we thought we'd break down personal example. This is the first property that I house hacked. It was just a boring 2-bedroom, 2-bath condo in Beaverton. I put down 6,500 or 6,350 because back then the purchase price in 2014 was only 127,000, so I could get away with that. Sorry, those days are gone, guys. And at the time I was going through my credit union and they paid for my appraisal. So I had relatively low costs, and we negotiated with the seller to pay my closing costs and expenses. So I just brought my down payment and then spent about $6,000 after closing, updating it a little bit so it wasn't so boring. And my Monthly payment was about 801 and my HOA dues were 249. And this is what it looked like for me year one. So my actual cash flow year one, the year that I moved out and put a tenant in it, I was negative $750 toward the mortgage. However, the equity that I had, and I'm already accounting for paying a realtor, which at the time I was not one, so now I don't have to do that. But back then, even if I had to pay a realtor and sell the property, I would have got 18,000. And my original down payment was 6,300. So I felt like that was a pretty good deal. In year 5 of that property, I was cash flow positive $1,722, which nobody gets excited about, but rental real estate investing is a slow burn, guys. The rest of the numbers on here are projections for future income. And for me, the initial money that I put into it, the 6,000 getting me 28K a year after it was paid off, was a pretty sweet return on my investment at that point. And if I was going to sell it at that point, I'd get 590,000. But I got tired of being on the board because I've been on the board in all the HOAs I owned in and decided to trade out of my condos. So in 2022, I beat the equity. So if we go back in year 10, I was supposed to have $115,000 in equity, but in year 8, I actually had $185,000 in equity. So I bought a 2-unit property, and I'm cash flowing 6,600 in my first year. My equity was the same. That's basically my down payment on the new property. And I had the seller pay my closing costs and put on a new roof and basically got almost turnkey rental with no money out of pocket. So now I'll show you how my actual replacement property through my 1031 exchange is supposed to do. So the actual projected cash flow for my first year was like 3,300, but I had very low expenses, so I cash flowed 6,600 my first year. And by year 5, you know, it doesn't look that great, but I think I'll continue to beat that. My tenants take really good care of my house. And so for me, that original $6,000 investment, now that I've traded in this property, instead of getting $28,000 a year, I'll be getting $51,000 a year when this mortgage is paid off. So that's a great way to trade from one property to another. And when you're low on cash to start, I don't want anybody to think that it doesn't mean you can't grow into a portfolio later. Since most of the participants here are from Eugene, I'm not going to spend a ton of time on Portland rules, but for those of you who are in the Portland market, there are some additional considerations and layers here that are different than the rest of the state. There are more hoops to jump through. And for those of you who are in Eugene and considering being a long-term landlord, and anything over 30 days, even midterm rental, follows landlord-tenant law. And in Eugene, you guys are starting to follow the Portland rules. I know you guys already have a screening fee cap and some of these other things are starting to come into place. So if you've never rented out a property before, I would encourage you to at least talk to a property manager or join the local RIA if you're not already a member, or join the local rental housing alliance. I know you guys have a Eugene specific one down there, and we have several around the Portland area. Our tips for success. Number 1, screen your tenants. And by screen your tenants, I don't just mean run a credit report and rent to them. I mean, pick up the phone, call their employer, and confirm that they work there. I've seen fake pay stubs when I was a property manager. People do fake those. Some of them are pretty decent at Photoshop, so it's important to actually call. And I also call every landlord. I call their current one, I call their past one. And if on their credit report, there's a bunch of addresses that are apartments that they didn't state on their application, I call them too. Previous landlords will tell you more about a tenant than the current landlord. The current landlord might have a problem tenant and they're just happy to get rid of them and tell you everything. But the previous landlord, where they moved out and they had to spend $3,000 repairing the unit from all the holes in the drywall and resodding the grass because the tenant let the grass die and things like that, might help you decide whether or not you want to take that risk on. Number 2, set boundaries. So no matter what you do, If you want to be the maintenance guy, know that you have to have your phone on and you're going to get the midnight calls if you're okay with that. If you're not okay with that, maybe consider paying for an after hours maintenance service who will take the calls on your behalf so that your tenants know how to reach you and get a hold of you. They're not your family, so if they're late on rent, you shouldn't like to say, yeah, okay, get me when you're like good, and then 6 months later, call me because you want to sell your property because you don't know what to do and they haven't paid rent in 6 months. Use a legally binding rental agreement. For those of you who are BiggerPockets members, I know they say that they are compliant, but as somebody who has been a professional property manager, I can 100% tell you the free rental agreements from the KeyCheck one on Furnish Finder, from Zillow, from BiggerPockets, they're all garbage. They do not follow Oregon state law. So make sure you're buying one from the local rental housing alliance or one of the other local forms that are created by a group of attorneys. Otherwise, you'll end up in court. Oregon has a provision in landlord tenant law that says you can't have any illegal terms in your rental agreement. And if you do, and you're suing a tenant for a legitimate reason, you can actually lose in court for that. So make sure to use a good rental agreement and inspect your property. I don't know how many times over the years I've sold a property because somebody had a tenant that paid on time for 5 years or 10 years, and they never checked on them. And when the tenant moved out, they had to completely gut the house. So I personally inspect my units twice a year. It doesn't matter whether or not I have a good tenant who keeps the house immaculate. There's just going to be things that they don't notice. And it's your asset and you're helping pay for your retirement. So you want to make sure it's in good condition. And then the last thing I would say is golden rule. Treat your tenants like you would like to be treated. Your tenants are people just like you are. If the stove breaks and it's a couple days before Thanksgiving and they've got family coming from out of state, which actually happened to a couple of my tenants a few years ago, my repair guy said it was going to take 3 weeks to get the part. And I just didn't think that was right. So I went with a U-Haul and bought a new stove at Lowe's and drove it over to the rental. And they were so grateful. And they've been the best tenants since I was willing to do that for them. Your tenants are helping pay for your retirement. So the least you can do is be a good landlord and take care of them. You have an obligation to maintain the house and the amenities that you're providing. So there's some pros and cons of landlording. Number one, income is predictable. I think that's the thing that I like the most about it. There's also the tax benefits, and it's a fairly stable investment. The cons are it can take a while before you see returns, especially in our current interest rate market. Emergencies and maintenance things generally happen at times that are not convenient. Last summer, I was getting on a plane to go to my niece's graduation, and my tenant called and said the air conditioner broke, and can I please get a service tech over there while I was in line for boarding? So just know that that stuff's going to happen. You have to know how to deal with it. And of course, you're taking on a lot of risk and liability when you're providing housing to someone else, whether it's in a hospitality capacity for Airbnb or whether it's your house you're renting to long-term tenants. If somebody trips and falls on your property, you could get in trouble for that. If you violate the lease, even accidentally, you could be on the hook for quite a bit of money. So it's not perfect. I'm not saying that real estate's easy for everybody. I'm not saying it doesn't take time, but it is a good way to get in there. So I was a professional landlord for over 10 years before I became a realtor. In that time, I screened anywhere from 100 to 150 tenants a year, and I managed 10 to 15 unit turnovers every month. I personally have 5 rental units, and I am an Airbnb superhost with 5-star reviews. I also have midterm rentals, and for my clients who purchase with me for the first vacancy, I teach them what I know. So you get all of my screening experience. I'm going to download it and teach it to you. We're going to do your applications together. I'm going to give you the legally binding rental agreement. I'm going to show you the software that I use to track rent and collect expenses. And if you are hands off and just want to pay somebody else to deal with it, I have referrals for short-term property managers as well as long-term property managers. And here is my contact information. I'm a principal broker again with Moore Realty. And then we have reasons to choose Chris.
Yeah, firstly, I will second a lot of what Melissa said, that her vast array of different experiences is really, really helpful when it comes to analyzing and choosing strategies, choosing particular properties. She's a real wealth of knowledge, and it's kind of a cheat code to have all of those services that she provides as you get into a property, especially if it's your first one. For me, my background, like I mentioned, I have about 20 plus years as a renovator, flipper. I own long-term and short-term rentals. And so I've done a lot of different things. I've messed up in a lot of different ways. I've succeeded in a few of them as well, and I like to share those experiences, both good and bad. And I love spreadsheets. I love helping people look at deals, analyze whether something is the right fit for their strategy or their goals. And so I like running numbers for people, and I do it a lot. And then when we do find the right strategy, the right property, then I help people match the loan products to that strategy, to that particular piece of property, to make sure that your money is working as hard as you are. Because as Melissa mentioned, it's not easy work. It can be very rewarding. It can be very lucrative, but it's not necessarily easy work. Anybody who says real estate is passive income is trying to sell you something, or hasn't had a whole lot of experience with it. So it's not passive, but it's good for you. And my contact info is here. And you'll get copies of this recording as we send those out here, probably either later this evening or tomorrow morning. And that is all that we have for tonight. So I'm sure as we've been speaking a lot, hopefully your wheels have been turning a little bit and you've been able to come up with some questions. So we want to open it back up to everybody, and we will just start and see where we go from there. But this is the end of our presentation, so if you need to go, feel free. Oh, Grace showed up. Hi, Grace. So for those who do want to stick around and ask questions, fire away.
I have a question. This is Lilia.
Hello.
Hi. So I've talked to you about my situation, so you know that there's not a lot of, I guess, I don't know. I still have to be really creative if I want to get another property.
Yeah.
Somebody mentioned, like, in the college town area, buying something for like renting out each room, and I thought, oh, that kind of piqued my interest because my daughter's going to the U of O, and she has been in those situations where she had to pay rent per room, and I kept thinking, gosh dang, this place is so tiny,
Yeah.
and it's like $1,000 each room, and I'm like, wow, that's such a great idea. So maybe can you talk more about that?
So Lilia, that's a strategy that I really encourage a lot of my clients who are in your position to do. And because I'm assuming your daughter's over 18, yes?
Correct. Yes.
Okay.
She's 21 this year.
Anyone who's over 18 can be on the loan with you. You're going to be a non-occupant co-borrower, but the benefit of co-signing and getting your daughter into this property is you're going to teach her how to be a landlord, but also you don't have to put 15 or 20% down to buy her a house. You can put as little as 3 or 5% down because your daughter is a first-time home buyer and an owner-occupier.
Nice.
I will say that college rentals tend to take a bit more of a beating to the
Yeah.
long-term rental. Most college students are not as cognizant of the ways that they can damage houses, or they just don't care one way or the other. So you can expect your costs to be a fair amount higher for any sort of replacement and because they are, typically they're turning over either every once a year, or, you might get them to stay for a couple of years, but there's going to be a fair amount of turnover. So, and sometimes you end up doing like a 10-month lease rather than a full year if they're going to be gone over the summer. But a caveat to that, actually, one of the great strategies that I've heard people do here in Eugene is to rent it out on a 9-month lease to students and then Airbnb it over the summer. It's a little bit more worked because you have to move in furniture and stuff before you Airbnb it. But you can take advantage of the high season here in Eugene and rent it out over the summer and then turn it back into a student rental. So it's
And-
kind of, can be a twofer.
I was going to say a couple other things about student rentals. Definitely if there's carpet, maybe you keep it because it's fine when they move in, but when they move out, don't ever put carpet back in there.
Right.
Put permanent vinyl flooring. And I would say most college students don't come with furniture. So if you want to buy some cheap beds and mattresses and let them bring their own sheets and stuff, that's really helpful for people who are using college rentals. A lot of the kids don't have furniture.
Yeah.
And then that would also help you if you're going to Airbnb it during the summer.
Yeah, potentially.
Uh,
Milani, you got your hand up there.
Yes. What are some strategies you folks use to build funds for times when there's vacancies?
That's an excellent question. So when I'm meeting with all of my real estate investors, I tell them that if they're buying a single family home, they should be budgeting 1% of the purchase price annually if they have the funds to put aside until they get to $25,000. And just keep that in an interest-bearing high yield savings account so that when the roof comes due, if that's $12,000, you've got the money for it. If the furnace dies and that's $6,000, you've got the money for it. When it's time to repaint, you've got the money for it. If you're buying new construction or you're buying a condo, I usually scale that back to 0.5% of the purchase price. And if you're buying a multi-unit property, I don't think you have to quadruple it if you're buying a fourplex, but maybe you should have 35 or 40K for a slush fund. Like in a typical single family home, I see roof prices in the Portland metro area be 12 to 15,000, but on a fourplex, that's like 25 to 30K.
Yeah. So, yeah, I don't think there's a secret way to build up more capital, but it is definitely something that you need to consider when you're getting into a rental property is how much you have for those reserves. And I think Melissa's guidelines on both of those are pretty spot on.
I see Mike's hand.
Yeah.
Question, due to longevity and then also big down payments and appreciation, 3 of my properties, my rentals, combined have close to $1 million in equity. How do I tap that? You want to make some comments, Chris?
There are a handful of different ways. Depends on your strategy. If you want to keep those properties, if they're good properties that you want to continue to hold, then you can do HELOCs, home equity line of credit. For those who don't know what HELOC is, they tend to be, those are great. I recommend that almost everybody who owns a property have a HELOC. They're great for short-term capital needs. You can also do just a straight refinance into a new loan. So a home equity loan, which
No, they're all around 3%.
yeah, that's the thing is a lot of people don't want to trade out from their 3%, 4% mortgages. And I get that. You can, through some lenders, get a portfolio loan. We don't do those, but I know that if you have a portfolio of properties that you want to lend against altogether, but yeah, tapping into equity is one of the best ways to scale your portfolio quickly. So
OCCU on your non-owner occupied will only give you 50K HELOCs.
Yeah.
Are there like conventional companies that step in and do HELOCs even if they're not in first?
yes, yeah, we can do non-owner occupied HELOCs up to sometimes 70 to 75% loan to value, with 250 to 350K max line. So yeah, credit unions can be a great resource if it's an owner occupied place, but most will not do on a rental property. So, but we have solutions for that.
Awesome.
Anybody else? Who else has a question? Yes, Nilani.
Sorry, question queen here.
Sure.
So I hear a lot of people talking about putting properties into LLCs. So I don't know much about why someone would want to do that or when it would be a good idea. So could you please speak on that?
Yeah, I can speak to that. So first of all, a lot of people want to have an LLC because they view it as providing them some sort of protection and a layer between them and the tenants. I will say though that most people who are doing this don't set up their LLC correctly with an operating agreement. And I'll pick on me. So I'll just say I'm going to name it Melissa Hart Vixen LLC. And then if I buy 3 properties as Melissa Hart Vixen LLC, how hard do you think it is for somebody to find me in court as the actual owner?
Yeah.
Personally, I don't own any of my properties in LLCs, and I would say most entry-level investors don't own them in LLCs because you cannot get a government-backed loan with an LLC. Can't get a conventional loan, can't get an FHA loan, can't get a VA loan. So we're talking about people with investor dollars who are forming LLCs. And the other caveat is that you're putting way more money down and you're not necessarily protecting yourself by having the LLC. I personally have a $2 million umbrella policy to cover my liability.
Yeah.
And I have ironclad rental agreements, and I've been in property management since 2011, and I still actively go to RIA meetings. I still go to the Landlord Study Hall, which is a local thing up in Portland, which is hosted by one of the big landlord tenant attorney firms. So I'm always up on the rules. And if you're new and you're not sure what you're doing to give yourself protection, and if you don't have the money to buy as an LLC as an investor, then I strongly encourage you to hire a property manager and get that umbrella policy to give yourself protection. Chris, do you want to add on?
Yeah, I will second the umbrella policy. That's the first step that any landlord or property owner should take. It's far cheaper than going into an LLC and is actually going to provide you more liability protection. We actually, if you're at the RIA meeting a couple days ago, the speaker was an estate planner. We talked a lot about LLCs, and they can be great for long-term thinking, but they are a bit of a step up from the beginning stage. So initially, I wouldn't worry myself too much about LLCs. Go with the umbrella policy. It's going to be better. I will say there's a caveat to purchasing within an LLC, and that is a lot of people, when they start, they will buy a property, get the loan in their own name, and then once the sale is finalized, they can transfer title into an LLC beyond that. So that is a way. It's the lenders don't really care once the loan is closed. And so that can be a way to do it, but I agree that the
I'm gonna call a red flag on that one. I just sat through a class with an attorney at Dunn and Carney where she had somebody's loan called due on a conventional loan and they put in an LLC. So I will say it's highly unlikely. It's very rare that it happens. I mean, Dunn and Carney is one of the biggest firms in Portland, but she's seen it happen twice in the last 3 years. So
oh, interesting. Yeah, I've never heard of it before, but that's good to know. So umbrella policy for sure.
yeah, like mine's like $600 a year for $2 million.
Yeah,
It's like really cheap.
Yeah, they're not expensive.
Anybody else?
Other questions? Yep. Nicole. Oh, Nicole and then Riley, we get you next.
I didn't know how to raise my hand virtually, but yeah, I had a question about the BRRRR method. You said there's no stupid questions, so
Nope.
The rent part, does that have to be long term for the
No.
BRRRR method, or can you short term rental?
No, you can short-term rental too. So that's what I did with my duplex. So I BRRRR'd an old 1891 house in the Whitaker down here in Eugene. And it's a duplex. The upstairs is a long-term tenant. They've been there forever. The downstairs, I turned from an old hair salon into a nice 3-bedroom Airbnb. And then I refinanced. So I created a lot of value through the renovation work. And then I refinanced when I was done. I pulled about half of my capital that I had put into it. I pulled about half of it back out. And then it is now a short-term rental for the downstairs unit. So it's a little bit of a combination. So the rent side can go either direction, short term, medium term, long term, whatever's right for the property.
I will,
I did want to ask you about that, sorry. How you have a short-term and a long-term tenant on the same property.
Mhm.
Do you ever have any issues with that, with the long-term tenant not being happy with you having people coming in and out very much?
It's it's a unique situation. The guy who lived there, he's a great guy, and I told him right up front of what my plan was for the property, and he said, "That's fine with me. I'm pretty low key. I'm chill. I'll stay out of the way." And I haven't had any complaints from him about folks in the Airbnb. I've had maybe one complaint about him from folks in the Airbnb. So there's, anytime you have people next to each other, there's going to be some risk for conflict. But this was something that was, I was very clear with my intentions up front. He was okay with it, signed his own lease, continuing to move forward. And so it's a situational dependent strategy for sure.
Okay, yeah, because we have our main house and then we have a separate detached house. Basically, it's a 2-car garage with a studio on it. And we had a realtor come by, and she was saying that we should just fix up that little studio and rent out the studio. But we were going to actually just use the whole garage area and make it a whole like big house or whatever and have 2 houses here. But we were wondering if we should do one long term, one short term, or both short term. And so, yeah, thank you for answering that.
Yeah, I think as long as you are upfront, especially with the longer term tenant, if you're saying, hey, this house or this unit next door is going to be a short term, and you tend to get the kind of people that you advertise for when you have a short term rental. So if you're advertising it to traveling nurses, you're likely going to get traveling nurses and people who are more responsible. So you want to make sure that the type of tenant that you're inviting in is going to be compatible with somebody living next door.
and I
Okay.
just quickly wanted to add for the refinance component, Nicole, on Chris's deal. It's largely he was able to refinance because the value he had improving the property. If
Right.
you're trying to use rent to qualify, most conventional and government-backed loans do not let you count Airbnb rental income unless you've had at least 2 years of tax returns for that. So if you add improvement value, great, you can refinance. But if you're trying to count the rent to get there, the appraiser's gonna base it off of long-term rental rates. So if it doesn't pencil as a long-term rental, you may not be able to pull out the money.
Yeah, there are DSCR loan options that will take into consideration Airbnb investment or Airbnb income, but they do tend to come with much higher rates. So there's a trade-off there, but they can be more flexible. So Riley was next. Do you still have a question, Riley?
Yeah, Zach and I are getting ready to start renting our property here in Portland, and I was curious if we do end up calling a previous landlord and they give us a scolding review of a tenant, are we still able to reject a tenant based purely off the word of mouth of that previous landlord, or are we going to run into issues there?
So you guys are buying in Portland specifically. I'm gonna help you with this. There's certain questions you can and cannot ask in Portland. So when we get to that stage, I promise I'll help you. But generally speaking, part of your rental criteria is landlord history verification. So you can go ahead and deny off of them if you have a strong case. If they're just like, yeah, they're a bad tenant, they were lame, don't rent to them, that doesn't stand up. But if they're like, hey, they trashed my place, they had thousands of dollars worth of damage. In Portland, you still have to rent to a tenant even if they owe a landlord $1,000 technically using the low barrier criteria. So we'll be using individualized assessments for you guys on all your properties because we're not going to use the low barrier criteria in Portland. For the rest of the state, that doesn't apply to you. You have different screening rules than Portland does.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, I figured it was going to be kind of complicated given Portland's rules, but appreciate it.
That's why we're mentoring you after closing. So don't worry, you'll be fine.
Tyler.
Yeah, I had a question regarding potential investment on our property that we're living on. I have a gravel RV space that I have rented out to people in the past in their own RV. And then now that we have our own RV, it's our parking, but when we move out, we're considering investing in a tiny home to rent out or just going back to renting out an RV. Do you have any experience with tiny home rentals? Would it be worth the investment to put that on our RV space or renting out to just an RV, someone bringing their own RV to our space?
I don't have any experience directly putting tiny houses on. I know that they can be great when it comes to cash flow, but when it comes to financing tiny homes and refinancing properties with tiny homes on them, and even ADUs specifically, or more generally, they don't have to be tiny. But I know that refinancing things with ADUs is difficult to get the value that you put into the cost of building the ADU or buying the tiny home, whichever it is. The bump in value that you're going to get on the property is not going to match the investment that you put into it. So just because there aren't a whole lot of ADUs and tiny houses out there to use as comparables that have sold in the recent 12 months, that an appraiser is going to show. The appraiser is not going to show you that as much value just because it's a newer thing, and there are only a handful of places, I think, in the country where there are enough ADUs that have sold recently that you're going to get a lot of value in your property because you have an ADU. So if you're doing it for cash flow, that's great. And if you have the money to put into it, you can get great cash flow, but your financing options aren't going to be any rosier because you have that ADU or because you have that tiny home.
Good to know. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, anybody else, or should we all call it an evening?
Let's see. Lily asked a question about 1031 across 2 different states. And do you want to expand on 1031 at all, Melissa? Or I know we're going to talk about that a little bit more down the road.
Yeah, so we're already getting like such advanced students. So a 1031 exchange will say that you will have to use, I use an exchange provider, basically an attorney who's going to structure it so that they're going to hold the money. You pay them a fee. The most common exchange is where you sell a property first and then acquire a new one. And there's certain timelines that the IRS puts on that. So once you have sold the property, you have a 45-day identification window, and you can only pick a specific number of properties. And if they all go pending and they're sold to somebody else, you can't identify new properties. So that's a little tricky for people who are not familiar with it. And on the back end, you have to close within 6 months of that 45 days. However, when we start getting into the later months of the year, it starts to get awkward for people's taxes if you're selling in December and closing in February. So it's a little bit tricky. That is the also cheapest exchange. The last 1031 I did that way, I think cost me about $1,250 for the exchange provider. I have great exchange recommendations, and they can help you. It doesn't matter what state you're in or what county you're in. I've used them quite a few times. They've been around for a long time. But there are other types of exchanges, and they're a little more expensive and they're a little more complicated. If you buy a replacement property first and then sell yours, I've seen those cost clients in the range of $15,000 to do it that way. So it's not ideal. But if you have your heart set on a specific property, that might be the better way for you to go with the 1031. But you want agents and lenders who are knowledgeable about this if you're not going to be paying in cash. There's also requirements about trading up in value, because if you don't, you're technically creating a tax event, and you also have to keep the same entities. So if you own as a married couple and just one of you wants to buy the replacement property, that technically doesn't work. There's also rules about buying property from family and things in 1031.
Yeah. So thank you for the question.
I will definitely call you.
Okay, that's good.
Yeah. Well, if there aren't any other questions, we will wrap up this this evening's event. You'll be getting a link with the recording here, either with this
I'll
evening.
probably send it out tomorrow. I have a super early meeting tomorrow, but I'll get it out around lunchtime.
Yeah. And yeah, like I said, we are always available for consultations or questions. We love to teach others. We love to help others experience the power of real estate, and that's why we're here doing what we're doing. So thanks for joining us this evening, and we'll send out more information on the next class and hopefully chat with each of you individually between now and then.